Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ariana Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. We're so glad to have everybody here joining us today for this virtual NPT side event, Nuclear Threats and Nuclear Sharing versus the Non-Proliferation Regime. A few administrative items before we jump into substantive matters. As this event is occurring in Zoom's meeting format, please be sure to keep your microphones muted throughout for the audio quality for everyone. We will have a Q&A section in the second half of today's event. So as you're listening to the speakers, please keep in mind questions and feel free to submit them throughout. You don't need to wait till the end through the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And please note, you probably just received the notice that this meeting is being recorded, and we look forward to sharing it publicly after the meeting's over later on throughout the conference. So earlier this week, Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy published a paper by the same title as today's event, examining the legal status of nuclear threats, negative security assurances, and nuclear sharing agreements. This was written in response to recent deeply concerning developments. A few weeks ago, too, Arms Control Today published an excellent article, Negative Security Assurances After Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, by one of our panelists, Dr. Francesca Giovannini. She's the executive director of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Today, in addition to me, you'll hear from Francesca and LCNP's own Dr. John Burroughs as well. And we look forward to having a conversation with all the participants here today through the questions shortly later this afternoon. So to kick things off, I'd like to jump right in and offer a few framing remarks to begin the discussion about nuclear threats and the landscape we face today. The landscape today of heightened distrust, a growing nuclear arms race, and the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, which includes credible nuclear threats, underscores the fundamental necessity above all of nuclear abolition. Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy has maintained now for decades the nuclear weapon states must find a way to commence multilateral negotiations on the global elimination of nuclear arms in accordance with the nuclear disarmament obligation under the NPT and general international law. This goal will never be achieved if a process to achieve it never truly starts. Threats to actually use nuclear weapons jeopardize the likelihood and effectiveness of productively negotiating disarmament. And unfortunately, over the last several years, we can point to several disturbing examples of nuclear threats issued by heads of state and other nuclear possessor state representatives. The United States and North Korea come to mind in 2017, as does Pakistan in 2019. While the threats that occurred in these situations were credible, unacceptable, and illegal, Russia's threats this year occur in the concrete context of a full-scale armed conflict, a war of aggression. This context matters deeply as it speaks to the increased risk that illegal threats could be followed by devastating illegal attacks amidst a war. As a reminder, President Putin on several occasions has raised the possibility of Russian resort to nuclear weapons should the United States and NATO states intervene militarily in the war in Ukraine. On the day of the invasion, February 24th, Putin said, quote, "For those who may be tempted to interfere in these developments from the outside, they must know that Russia will respond immediately, and the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history." This is a legally cognizable threat, both credible and specific in form. It expresses a readiness to resort to force should addressee states, quote, "interfere" in Russian military operations in Ukraine. Moreover, especially when combined with invocations at other times of Russia's nuclear weapons capabilities, quote, "consequences such as you have never seen" is meant to be understood as a reference to use of nuclear weapons. Statements like Putin's are clearly illegal because they signal the intent to commit an illegal act, here the use of nuclear weapons, should certain conditions be met. To establish illegality of a threat of force, credibility is important. In 2008, a fact-finding mission established by the Council of the European Union to investigate the Russo-Georgian War found that, quote, "a threat is credible when it appears rational that it may be implemented, when there is a sufficient commitment to run the risk of armed encounter." Credibility does not require certainty as to whether force will be used, what conditions will trigger force, or whether the threatened force is imminent. The investigative report from that fact-finding mission said that all that matters is that the use of force is sufficiently alluded to and that it is made clear that it may be put to use. Credibility is best understood in the context of an existing dispute. In the current case of Russia versus Ukraine, Russia's credibility when threatening nuclear use is not in question. Russia is backed by the world's largest nuclear warhead arsenal, and its head of state issued the above quoted, earlier quoted threat at the start of an actual conflict. In the context of this invasion, Putin's threat is illegal in a second way. It's the element of an unlawful invasion itself, the use of force against the territorial integrity and independence of a state in violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. Article 2.4 requires refraining from threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or the use of force and threat of force for any purpose inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations. If a use of force would violate that article, the threat to engage in that force also violates the article. The International Court of Justice further explained in its 1996 Nuclear Weapons Advisory Opinion that if a weapon would not meet the requirements of international humanitarian law governing the conduct of warfare, the threat of such use would also be contrary to that law. While the nuclear-armed governments, including the United States, including Russia here, have yet to accept the illegality of use of nuclear weapons under international humanitarian law, the truth is widely recognized. Most centrally, nuclear weapons cannot meet the requirements of discrimination between military targets and civilian persons and infrastructure, or avoidance of severe destruction of the environment. Putin's threat in February and subsequent threats seek to shield unlawful Russian conventional military operations by deterring US and NATO states from a direct military intervention to assist in Ukraine's lawful self-defense pursuant to Article 51 of the UN Charter. Such an intervention would be lawful if requested by Ukraine. The threat to use nuclear weapons directly affects the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its review process that's just begun this week. Nuclear threats counteract and weaken existing commitments made by NPT states parties in 2000 to reduce the role for nuclear weapons in security policies to minimize the risk that these weapons will ever be used, and to engage with all nuclear weapon states in processes leading to the, quote, total elimination of their arsenals. These commitments were each affirmed in the 2010 Review Conference Action Plan as nuclear weapon states committed to accelerate concrete progress on nuclear disarmament. Credible threats, particularly in the context of an active war, instead increase the role of nuclear weapons in state policy and jeopardize productive processes among nuclear weapon states to fully disarm. This month's review conference offers states parties a crucial opportunity to strongly condemn any and all threats of nuclear force. When earlier this year, the Security Council failed to adopt a resolution condemning Russia's threats and actions in Ukraine, the General Assembly took up the issue in a special emergency session, which overwhelmingly adopted a resolution demanding an end to Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine and calling for Russia to further refrain from any further use or threat of use against UN member states. The NPT Review Conference affords another opportunity for states party to the treaty to condemn in the strongest of terms all threats to use nuclear weapons, and furthermore offers the forum for nuclear weapon states to finally and truly make some progress on their longstanding commitments to fully disarm. Continuing threats of engaging in nuclear devastation by nuclear weapon states not only impede this process, but endanger the global population and the health of our environment. So relatedly, the invasion of Ukraine backed by nuclear threats demonstrates another urgent need. That's to strengthen negative security assurances issued in 1995 by the 5 NPT nuclear-armed states. So concluding my initial remarks on threat, I'd like to now turn to Dr. Francesca Giovannini to explore the status of negative security assurances today. As mentioned earlier, Dr. Giovannini recently published a comprehensive look at these assurances in the July 2022 issue of Arms Control Today. I will link to her article as well as the recent LCNP paper in the chat shortly. Francesca is the executive director of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. In addition, she's a non-residential fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. In years prior, Dr. Giovannini served as strategy and policy officer to the executive secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization based in Vienna. She also served for 5 years at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston as director of the research program on global security and international affairs, after beginning her career working for international organizations and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Francesca, we are so glad to have you with us today, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Ariana, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I really want to thank the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy for its invitation. I took on the leadership role at the Belfer Center 1.5 years ago, and one of my goals is really for Harvard to come to the fore in being in real dialogue with the many NGOs and other academic and policy institutions that are doing real good work on the future of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. I also want to thank Ariana in particular for offering me the opportunity to discuss with you the argument of the article that I published on arms control. And I have to recognize this was an imperfect article, written in a state of anxiety and anger for what I was seeing unfolding. And in a way underpinned by this idea that, look, we are in a moment of truth when it comes to global governance. And Ukraine, to me, really represents a breaking point. And the way in which we'll decide to improve or undermine international institutions will bear catastrophic consequences for the future. So Ukraine is not only, as some have tried to portray it, a regional conflict. It is way more than this. I think there are many dimensions of the Ukraine conflict that are really important for the future of global governance. There is a relation between a rising democracy and an authoritarian regime. There is the question of proxy war between the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world, the United States and NATO and Russia. But above all, there is also a very big question about how do we intend to move forward and protect all the countries that have made a pledge not to acquire nuclear weapons in the future. So where is the protection regime going? And how do we intend to use the Ukraine crisis and the Ukraine war not to escape from those responsibilities, but to actually strengthen them? Let me also mention in an excellent Foreign Affairs article, Tanisha Fazal actually talked about Ukraine as a potential precedent that would open up what she calls a new age of territorial conquest. And she argues that the response to the Ukraine war will ultimately determine whether we are entering into pure anarchy, and we will therefore just accept the fact that the strongest countries in the world will do whatever they want to conquer and invade other countries, or whether we return to a world where shared norms and principles are going to be upheld. Now, Tanisha says that it will depend very much on how the international community will choose to respond to Ukraine. Let me then say and share with you my skeptical view. What we are hearing in the West is that there is a real, campaign to support Ukraine. But if you actually look internationally, that's not so much the reality. The West has responded, but the rest of the world has been pretty lukewarm, let's just say, in dealing with Ukraine. And there are many cases in which we know countries do support Russia. This will have some serious consequences, again, in how we think about the future of global governance. Now, to me, there are multiple dimensions. The nuclear dimensions of the Ukraine war, in my view, are even more severe. The first dimension that seems to me so striking is that for years, the international nuclear community has predicted that nuclear risks were going to be mostly severe in South Asia or in Northeast Asia. But I think what Ukraine demonstrates is that everywhere there are nuclear weapons, there is nuclear weapons risks. It doesn't matter whether you are a developed country or a developing country, whether you have political infrastructure or you don't. When you have nuclear weapons present, the nuclear weapons risks are always there. And I think the Ukraine case has clearly demonstrated that, yes, there are nuclear weapons risks severe and serious at the heart of Europe. And the European societies are completely unprepared to deal with those risks. The second dimension, in my view, what Ukraine, the nuclear dimensions of this Ukraine war reveal is that we have somehow stopped thinking about nuclear weapon states as a responsible nuclear weapon states. There was a narrative in 2004, 2005, that, if you remember, it was during the Bush administration years, where we were thinking about nuclear weapons responsibilities or responsible behavior. That was the reason why, for example, the Bush administration also somehow authorized the US-India deal, under the idea that nuclear weapon states can be responsible, have a responsible behavior, and therefore can be acceptable guardians of the world order. I think the Ukraine war sheds very clear lights that if you have nuclear weapons, most likely than not, you will actually behave in a predatory manner. And the third dimension of this Ukraine war that actually makes us completely unprepared is that for years we've talked about nuclear deterrence. We've looked mostly at the relations among nuclear weapon states. But the dimension of the Ukraine war that interests me the most and where we are completely unprepared is what I would call nuclear coercion, right? Is the leg up the nuclear weapons give you to be a predatory state and fundamentally be completely non-accountable. Now, let me also mention that I don't believe that Russia is the first nuclear weapon state to act in the predatory behavior. I think all nuclear weapon states have acted in rather predatory behaviors. If you think about the nuclear testing examples, for example, of France, of the United Kingdom, testing over the colonial territories, if you're thinking about the threats of President Eisenhower over China. So every time you have the relation between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, nuclear coercion is always present. Whether you formulate it, you verbalize it or not, non-nuclear weapon states know that any given point, their survival, their existence could actually be completely undermined by the decision of one state. So nuclear coercion is a problem that we have not dealt with very seriously in the last few years. So let me then mention my article and where it comes out from. When many, particularly in the Washington bubble, think about the Ukraine war, the main argument about negative security assurances was negative security assurances are completely useless at this point, and there are going to be two scenarios we will have to be dealing with. One, proliferation cascade. Mostly non-nuclear weapon states will rush to acquire nuclear weapons, or non-nuclear weapon states will ask to be able to enter into nuclear alliances to get nuclear security guarantees from a nuclear protector. My argument in the paper is that these arguments reveal a very simplistic understanding of the majority of the countries around the world. You are not going to see the countries that have committed to nuclear disarmament and to remain nuclear weapon-free countries rushing anytime soon to achieve nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are very costly. They actually don't demonstrate a very, major political utility. And many of these countries normatively have made a very clear commitment that they don't intend to embark in nuclear proliferation issues. So for me, the key question is, how do we protect those countries? Countries that are not rushing to get nuclear weapons or attempting to enter into a nuclear alliance. How do we target those countries? And the argument that the paper makes is a very clear one. To me, it's not the time to back down from negative security assurances. To me, it is time to double down and transform negative security assurances into something much stronger. In fact, let me also mention that my proposal argues that it is time for negative security assurances to become negative security guarantees and to be linked to institutional processes that are much broader. The nuclear community, particularly non-nuclear weapon states, are making a mistake, in my view, to talk about negative security assurances mostly only in the context of the NPT. I don't think this is a question only of the nuclear community. I think it's a question of global governance as a whole, to have the right not to be bombed or destroyed with a nuclear weapon. And so my suggestions are threefold, and I'd be very happy to hear your views, guys, particularly on the proposals on what we can do together on this. So in order to link negative security assurances to really broad institutional processes, the very first proposal I make is that it is time for the UN General Assembly to submit a political resolution that demand the veto power of the UN security members to be linked to the delivery of universal, binding, permanent negative security assurances to all non-nuclear weapon states. It is no longer acceptable to have a UN Security Council members, permanent members, that pretend to fulfill the UN Security Council mandate, which is what actually prevent wars, while actually going around and threaten the international community with nuclear weapons use. I think veto power needs to be tied to nuclear responsibilities. And the minimum bare standard that we can ask is negative security assurances. I also think the UN General Assembly needs to continue to push for a power shift that, exactly like Ariana said, has started, I think, already before with discussion of UN reform, but most importantly in April, when they decided to pass the resolution that said we need to make UN Security Council members accountable for the use of their veto power. I think the UN General Assembly needs to accept to play a much political role, particularly in making all nuclear weapon possessing states, so not only the P5, but the 9, more accountable for their choices. And so the UN General Assembly should run regular nuclear discussions and dialogues where the nuclear weapons possessing states need to be asked to provide information on any element of their nuclear structure, force, or doctrine that might have an impact on international security. The final point is the more practical one. I actually think that non-nuclear weapon states need to be very committed to get this legally binding universal negative security assurances. And so my suggestion is for every single regional economic agreement that these countries are going to sign, there should be a clause in those regional economic agreements demanding negative security assurances. We can't continue to have economic relationships, but at the same time threaten these countries with their very survival. Let me finish by saying I understand this proposal does not go far enough. I talked to Alex Ment, I talked to the TPNW crowd. I understand this is still, a incremental step. It might somehow feel also like a waste of time. But for me, there was something really important there. And the question of how would we protect countries that have made a true commitment to nuclear weapon-free world is something I really deeply care about. And so I understand the ultimate goal should be nuclear disarmament, but I was trying to respond to the urgency of the moment and try somehow to use this crisis really to waking up more of a normative process that might lead to a UN reform. It might ultimately lead to greater protection for the international community. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I'd like to turn directly over now to John Burroughs, Senior Analyst at Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, to broaden this conversation to include nuclear sharing agreements, both those longstanding and new. John, I'd also welcome, of course, any of your comments in response to my remarks on threat and Francesca's on negative security assurances before we open it up to our audience here. So, John, over to you. You are still muted, though. You might want to unmute there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariana. Maybe you can switch back to being the host. So you may think that nuclear sharing is an arcane issue in which Germany defended NATO nuclear sharing as compatible with the NPT, and China denied that it is compatible with the NPT and said that the spread of nuclear sharing to the Asia-Pacific region would be unacceptable. So it's a live issue, and not only with respect to Russia and Belarus. So some of you probably know that on June 25th, there was a public conversation between President Vladimir Putin of Russia and President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus. And they signaled that the two countries are planning a nuclear sharing arrangement similar to that which the United States has with several NATO countries. Putin indicated that Russia would train Belarusian pilots to operate Russian-supplied bombers already possessed by Belarus that would be modified to be capable of delivering Russian-supplied nuclear bombs. If the NATO nuclear sharing approach is followed, the bombs would remain under Russian control unless the decision was made to use them and the bombs were loaded on aircraft to be flown by Belarusian pilots. Possibly too, the bombs would not be stored in Belarus, but rather in Russia. Putin and Lukashenko also announced the planned deployment of nuclear-capable Iskander missiles in Belarus, which from a military point of view would be equally or more concerning to NATO. Russia-Belarus nuclear sharing is an alarming potential development that should be vigorously criticized by NPT states parties. If implemented, nuclear sharing and deployment of Iskander missiles may cause NATO to revise its policy of not basing nuclear weapons in post-Cold War NATO states, Poland and others. That would mean deepened reliance on and entrenchment of nuclear weapons on the NATO side, and then correspondingly on the Russian side. Also important, and I want to underline this, is that a failure to collectively condemn Russian-Belarus nuclear sharing as incompatible with the NPT could help set the stage for eventual nuclear sharing arrangements elsewhere in the world, notably in the Asia-Pacific region and in the Middle East. In fact, a nuclear sharing arrangement with the United States is now being publicly discussed in Japan due to an early 2021, that must be 2022, intervention by the late Shinzo Abe. It is worth noting that yesterday, China stated that nuclear sharing arrangements run counter to the provisions of the NPT. They said this as part of the NPT review conference, and China maintained that any attempt to replicate NATO's nuclear sharing model in the Asia-Pacific region would undermine regional strategic stability and be firmly opposed by the countries in the region. The incompatibility of nuclear sharing with the NPT is based on a straightforward application of NPT Articles 1 and 2. Article 1 requires NPT nuclear armed states not to transfer to any recipient whatsoever nuclear weapons or control over such weapons, directly or indirectly. It further requires the nuclear armed states not in any way to assist, encourage, or induce any non-nuclear weapon state to acquire nuclear weapons or control over such weapons. Article 2 imposes the corollary obligation on NPT non-nuclear weapon states not to be the recipient of any such transfer or assistance. Those provisions should be read in light of NPT review conference commitments made subsequent to the 1995 decision to indefinitely extend the NPT. Action 1 of the 2010 Action Plan commits all states parties, quote, to pursue policies that are fully compatible with the treaty and the objective of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. The 2000 final document reaffirms that the strict observance of the provisions of the treaty remains central to achieving the shared objectives of preventing, under any circumstances, the further proliferation of nuclear weapons and preserving the treaty's vital contribution to peace and security. So, a nuclear sharing policy that plans for a blatant violation of the NPT in the event of war is not a policy fully compatible with the treaty. Moreover, the NPT applies in any circumstance, including war. Other commitments made in 2000 also bear on the question. Establishment of a Russian-Belarus nuclear sharing arrangement would run counter to the commitment to a diminishing role for nuclear weapons in security policies. It also would not show good faith in implementing and pursuing another commitment, a very important commitment, the further reduction of non-strategic nuclear weapons based on unilateral initiatives and as an integral part of the nuclear arms reduction and disarmament process. Now, a separate post-95 development is the establishment of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Article 1G rules out any, quote, stationing, installation, or deployment, end quote, of nuclear weapons on the territory of a state party. This could be a significant constraint in some cases, existing or future. For example, the Philippines is a military ally of the United States, but as a TPNW state party, it is barred from entering into a nuclear sharing arrangement. While not bearing directly on interpretation of the NPT, the TPNW provision does show that a very significant number of states see nuclear sharing as a practice to be dismantled, not expanded. Here's the hard question. Under the NPT, does NATO nuclear sharing stand as a precedent that justifies the establishment of new nuclear sharing arrangements? The answer is no, but NPT states parties must energetically assert the incompatibility of new arrangements with the NPT, as was not done with respect to NATO nuclear sharing when the NPT was brought into effect. Prior to the signing of the NPT in 1968, the United States had nuclear sharing arrangements with a number of NATO countries. 5 still today participate in such arrangements: Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, though the exact status of the arrangement with Turkey is unclear. As I already mentioned, the essence of this peculiar arrangement is that pilots of participating countries are trained to operate aircraft to deliver US supplied nuclear bombs. Additionally, for some countries, the aircraft are supplied by the United States. The bombs normally remain in US custody, and their use in war must be authorized by the US president. Replacement of aircraft with more advanced models is ongoing or planned in Belgium, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. Back when the NPT was being negotiated, the United States and NATO intended to carry forward nuclear sharing after the NPT entered into force. The Soviet Union was most concerned with excluding NATO or a sub-NATO entity from obtaining control of nuclear forces. It acquiesced in the US interpretation that Articles 1 and 2 as negotiated would not exclude nuclear sharing with individual NATO states. Aside from the Soviet Union and NATO members, it seems that just a few other countries were advised of US interpretation during negotiation of the NPT. The NPT was open for signature on July 1st, 1968. The interpretation was made public in hearings before the Senate on July 9th, 1968. It was not made part of a formal international statement by the United States in connection with signature or ratification. So far as we know, no state made a formal objection to the interpretation in the period leading up to the NPT's entry into force. For some or many states, this may have simply been because they were unaware of the interpretation. However, at the 1995 NPT Review and Extension Conference and in subsequent NPT meetings up to the present, nuclear sharing has been a matter of controversy. The non-aligned movement recommends that the current review conference, quote, underscore the necessity of full and non-discriminatory implementation of Articles 1 and 2 of the treaty by all states parties, in particular nuclear weapon states, to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, including through nuclear weapons sharing with other states under any kind of security and military arrangements or alliances. If NPT states parties now communicate clearly and forcefully that new nuclear sharing arrangements are not compatible with the NPT, that will be important in terms of policy and also would put the legal issues in a new light. In no case should the argument that the United States put forward more than 5 years ago in support of its interpretation of Articles 1 and 2 be accepted. According to that argument, expounded by none other than Secretary of State Dean Rusk, nuclear sharing does not, quote, involve any transfer of nuclear weapons or control over them unless and until a decision were made to go to war, at which time the treaty would no longer be controlling, close quote. The contention that the NPT would not be legally binding in time of war, which Rusk qualified as general war in testimony before the Senate, is legally wrong, unworkable, and dangerously destabilizing. As we, Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, argued in a paper back in 1999. The US contention was implicitly rebuked, as I've mentioned, by the 2000 NPT final document reaffirmation that strict observance of treaty provisions is central to preventing, under any circumstances, the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. So in summary, at this review conference, NPT states parties should strongly express opposition to new nuclear sharing arrangements on both policy and legal grounds. They should also call for the termination of existing nuclear sharing. Ending NATO nuclear sharing would remove a model and rationale for the establishment of such arrangements elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. As a reminder to all our participants here, we're going to be moving on shortly to a Q&A segment with everyone, and we would love to hear what questions you have for any of the three of us. Let me bring Francesca, pin her up here with us as well. So yes, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions, and we may even be able to invite a couple of people to present their questions verbally if time permits throughout this section. To kick off the conversation though, I would like to turn back to the question of negative security assurances, Francesca, if that's okay. Your article touches on, in a portion of it, on no first use policies as adopted by China and India, referring to them primarily as a malleable declaratory policy. Could you speak a little bit further, perhaps, to how the malleability of no first use based on the needs of nuclear armed states might differ from the conditions and qualifications that are placed on most nuclear weapon states' negative security assurances?
Thank you so much, Ariana. And I think this is a really good question. So just to back like this overview of negative security assurances, one thing I wanted to mention is that if you look at the regime of negative security assurances per se, is actually fairly extensive. But the real issue of this regime is that it remains very conditional, rather untested, and when it is tested, like in the case of Ukraine, has completely failed. It's very transient and unilateral. So if you look, for example, at nuclear weapon states, in a few cases, nuclear weapon states have provided negative security assurances. There is a slightly preference for nuclear weapon states to provide positive security assurances. And so positive security assurances is to say, well, you are going to be attacked with nuclear weapons and I will come and help you. This is, for example, what China has provided to Ukraine, right? But for non-nuclear weapon states, positive security assurances mean very little, because it means that you will provide support after I've been attacked. So there is no guarantee that I would even be able to survive at that point. So the emphasis since 1960 has always been for non-nuclear weapon states on negative security assurances. So there have been unilateral declarations by some nuclear weapon states, but most of them have been highly conditional. So the United States has said, well, we'll provide negative security assurances if you will remain in good standing with the NPT. But of course, there is no definition of what good standing means, right? So it's completely unilateral, it's very subjective, and by the way, it's very transient. Now, no first use policies are slightly different because they are actually embedded more in the official nuclear doctrine. But in a way, no first use policies are more intended for other nuclear weapon states than for non-nuclear weapon states. So China and India, for example, with the delivery of no first use policies, are mostly intended somehow to give guarantees or a sense of stability in their relations with nuclear weapon states. When it comes to non-nuclear weapon states, no first use policies, in order to be credible in front of non-nuclear weapon states, will have to entail certain things. One, for example, you would not have to test nuclear weapons or delivery systems that might employ, for example, the delivery of nuclear weapons. And we know, for example, in the case of India and China, this has been violated already from the beginning. Both of them have tested dual use capable, delivery systems. You'd, for example, not have tactical nuclear weapons, because why would you have tactical nuclear weapons if you have no first use policies that intend not to strike non-nuclear weapon states? And we know that that's not the case. So the way in which I've interpreted no first use policies is it is more a way to reciprocate or provide stability in the nuclear deterrence relationship, but means very little, almost nothing when it comes to non-nuclear weapon states. And again, so I make a slight distinction, but I feel that when it comes down to the implementation, actually, that means almost nothing.
Thank you so much. John, I wonder if you would have anything to add to that, maybe speaking to relevant legal distinctions between negative security assurances and no first use policies beyond what Francesca has described.
Well, assurances of non-use are contained in protocols to regional nuclear weapon-free zones. Those protocols are treaties, they're legal instruments. So they are definitely binding. One problem is that some of the nuclear armed states have put in reservations to the extent of those non-use assurances. For example, if the country in question is allied with a nuclear armed states. Perhaps, Ariana, you were partly getting at this question of whether, let's say, the negative security assurances that were issued and incorporated in the Security Council resolution 1995, which was issued in connection with the very important NPT extension conference. Are those assurances, are they legally binding? From a lawyer's point of view, the answer is yes. And that's because they were part of an inducement for states to make a legal decision to extend the NPT. And indeed, the NPT was extended indefinitely, but that wasn't the only possibility. The NPT could have been extended for 1 year. So from a lawyer's point of view, those assurances are legally binding. I've already mentioned that, first of all, the assurances from 1995 reflect the Cold War, and so they have the qualification that they don't apply when a non-nuclear weapon state is allied with a nuclear weapon state. It's not true of China, and it hasn't been true of recent US and UK policy statements. So one course of action would be simply for the members of the permanent members of the Security Council, the nuclear armed states, to the NPT, to reissue updated negative security assurances, stripping them out of the conditions, incorporating them in a Security Council resolution. That's a fairly straightforward thing to do if if the nuclear armed states are willing to do that, and there's doesn't seem to be much prospect of reaching an agreement on Russia regarding such a step right now, but there likely would be other obstacles as well regarding the precise wording of the assurances. But you asked me about legal bindingness. Many or most countries really aren't satisfied with security assurances that are formally issued by the nuclear armed states and are incorporated in a Security Council resolution. They want to see guarantees of non-use embedded in a treaty. So they're apparently not impressed by lawyers' arguments about this. Those lawyers' arguments, by the way, can be important, like within deliberations in among decision makers in a nuclear armed state. So I'm not trying to dismiss the importance of them being legally binding, but most states aren't satisfied with them. They would like to see a legally binding treaty.
Could I add on this? I think you're absolutely right, John. When I talk to many of the non-nuclear weapon states, there is the idea of let's go back and rehash a UN resolution, right? This is the time to reissue another resolution by the UN Security Council. This is not going to cut it. I mean, the reality is the Ukraine had probably some of the most stringent, or at least the most extensive, negative security assurances delivered by the three signatories of the NPT, and his fate was completely sealed when Putin decided to invade. So the idea for me is that these negative security assurances now need to be embedded in much larger security and economic processes, because what credibility can the UN Security Council now have in delivering a resolution after the Ukraine war? I mean, even if they decide to do it, how would Congo, Brazil, or Mexico really feel about these negative security assurances? So it seems to me that, at least in the conversations I had, the sense of nuclear responsibility need to be embedded into political processes that also accompany, for example, the shift from a UN Security Council to more the UN General Assembly, right? They need to be embedded in UN reform processes. They need to be part of much larger conversations. And how we do this, I think that's the work needs to be done ahead. I don't dispute this. I also think on the nuclear weapons free zones, I've studied a lot, many of them, but even the parties to this regional treaties, I'm thinking about, the Bangkok Treaty of Southeast Asia. I mean, they've been placed under such conditionality, and the United States has refused to ratify most of the protocols. So the idea is what is actually enforceable and what is not here. And so I think these mechanisms could be helpful, but again, I think there are no political ties that could give them a real leg up here.
If I could just briefly respond, Ariana, it's involving the General Assembly more in matters of international peace and security really makes sense. And one could imagine, first of all, some of the nuclear armed states revising their assurances, and then that being sort of welcomed by the General Assembly. I'd also point out that the next NPT review conference is in only 3 years. So if we get through the current crisis, or should I say crises, given what's happening with China and Taiwan, perhaps things can be put on a more solid footing in 2025.
Thank you both. I think maybe it might be a good idea to transition back again to the question of nuclear sharing, particularly in light of some of the comments I see here in the chat and have been raised in many other conversations on this and related topics. To NATO's responsibility, the US and NATO's responsibility preceding the Russia-Ukraine war, and what accountability might look like there. And, John, maybe, I'll start with you again here in terms of maybe starting to address the significance of nuclear sharing overall, and expanding on some of what you were already speaking about in terms of the precedent that NATO agreements have set, regardless of the fact that legally it doesn't justify new nuclear sharing, as we were discussing earlier. What's the practical effect and what's the overall significance here?
Right. Well, the significance in sort of military strategic terms of particular instances of nuclear sharing is not really my sort of specialty, but I will say that I have seen many commentators raise questions about, what is the military importance of the nuclear sharing arrangements in NATO. The United States, Britain, and France have numerous military capabilities, nuclear military capabilities, aside from those bombs that are could be delivered by countries involved in nuclear sharing. And those capabilities include, shorter range or lower yield nuclear weapons. So that question is certainly raised. And similarly, a question could be raised about, well, let's say that this Russia-Belarus arrangement goes through. What would be the military significance of that? Well, again, I can't really assess that, but perhaps questions could be raised about just how much difference would it make. And I have seen suggestions that the Iskander missile, which could be nuclear or conventional, could be of more sort of military concern from a NATO standpoint. But then, what is the significance of nuclear sharing in terms of the scheme of the NPT? It is a kind of proliferation. The NPT is supposed to prevent proliferation, to lay the foundation for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And China seems quite concerned about the possibility of nuclear sharing being put in place in the Asia Pacific. And as I mentioned, it's part of public discussion in Japan right now. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but what I'm saying it's being talked about. And then one can come up with scenarios in the Middle East for nuclear sharing. Now, I'm not going to speculate about such possible arrangements, but they wouldn't necessarily involve, they wouldn't involve actually the United States. So regardless of how one assesses, the strategic significance of NATO nuclear sharing or Russia-Belarus nuclear sharing. Nuclear sharing is a bad thing because of the potential it has to just unwind to further unwind the non-proliferation regime.
I know you mentioned not wanting to speculate on Middle East implications, but I wonder if it's worth raising in light of the overlapping discussion on nuclear weapon-free zones as well. The prospect that expanded nuclear sharing and continued embracing of NATO nuclear sharing could affect the also delicate progress discussed at the NPT and beyond for a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. And if there is an interrelationship worth bringing into this discussion there between nuclear sharing, negative security assurances within nuclear weapon-free zones, and potential progress on a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. I know this is a large topic I'm raising, but I don't know if John, you or Francesca might like to contribute to this topic, or if anyone else in our audience has questions on this point or any of the other points. I don't see too many coming in, and I'd love to hear what everyone else is thinking as well.
Ariana, can I make a point? I wanted to reiterate something that John said that it seems really, really important. So if you think about tactical nuclear weapons, battlefield, nuclear weapons, it seems to me that really propel forward the shift from nuclear deterrence into a gray area of nuclear deterrence and nuclear warfighting, right? So we have justified, and in fact, the United States will add roughly 400 low-yield nuclear weapons to their arsenal in the modernization program. And if you look at the narrative, it's all about, making nuclear deterrence credible. But many of the declassified historical accounts related to tactical nuclear weapons reveal in reality a way more aggressive deployment of these weapons for actual use. And, we've been in contact recently with an historian in Ukraine who has done marvelous work on tactical nuclear weapons in Soviet Union. And they were all related to battlefield strategies. In fact, the Soviet Union at some point, planned to use multiple tactical nuclear weapons to break through the defense lines of the opponent. Nuclear sharing, to me, is one step towards nuclear warfighting. First of all, it increased the risk of miscalculation because it increased the number of countries that are supposed to control or maintain these nuclear weapons, and increase also the number of targets, right? That one has to, so inevitably in a way generate also an inevitable nuclear arm race. So you will have to add more delivery systems in order to be able to target more nuclear weapons bases. But in addition, it brings the countries closer to nuclear warfighting strategies. I think that is a shift that needs to be stopped from the beginning. My last point is this. When I gave a lot of talks in Italy, particularly in Italian newspapers and Italian TV shows, because all of a sudden at the beginning of the Ukraine war, Italy discovered to be a country that hosts nuclear weapons. In fact, I revealed to them that we are the largest tactical nuclear weapon in Europe. And Italians freaked out and thought, oh my God, can we be the target of, nuclear attack by the Russians? And technically, yes, you can be exposed, right? You can be considered part of this nuclear deterrence. And I have to be honest, for me, what is shocking is this country that hosts nuclear weapons, especially in Europe, have all somehow made political pacts not to talk about the presence of nuclear weapons in their own countries, leaving societies completely unprepared for what it is, right? Potential retaliation in a case of a nuclear crisis. So I think it opens a lot of, avenues for societies to have to grapple with nuclear risk that are completely unthinkable. So there are multiple problems in my view. Last point I want to make. When I was talking to the Italians, one of the critical questions they asked me is, do the Russians, the command and control for strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons are the same? Do they think about this use in the same way? And I think we have done very little work on tactical nuclear weapons. We speculate a lot of how countries think about the command and control of tactical nuclear weapons, but to be honest, we don't know very much. We don't know how Putin is thinking about this. And this leaves a vulnerability, a gap in knowledge that really needs to be filled out pretty quickly.
Ariana, can I answer your question also?
Absolutely.
Or actually, Francesca was addressing a separate question, but regarding your question of how would new nuclear sharing arrangements in the Middle East affect prospects for a WMD-free zone, my answer is badly. So that's my answer to that. There's a question from Carl Anderson, a friend and colleague of mine from Western States Legal Foundation in Oakland, California. And he notes that Jonathan Granoff, who's a member of the Lawyers Committee Nuclear Policy Board, along with Oscar Arias, former president of Costa Rica, published an article in which they essentially proposed that NATO giving up nuclear sharing practices could be part of the settlement of the Ukraine war. So my comment on that is, first of all, I think it's really a good idea to think creatively about how the war could be settled, not just a ceasefire, but settled on a permanent basis. And it looks to me as if that will have to involve steps that go beyond the immediate Ukraine-Russian relationship. You know, the United States and European states, I don't think they can be, and they don't want to be in the position of telling Ukraine, for example, you must give up certain pieces of territory in order to settle the war. So I think it's really useful to think about what is a larger framework in which the war could be settled. So some sort of commitment, I suppose, to end NATO nuclear sharing, and also, of course, not to go forward with Russia, Belarus nuclear sharing, could be part of such a larger settlement. You know, there's an operational problem, which, you know, diplomats and policy analysts are paid to solve, which is that NATO nuclear sharing will be very hard to unwind because it's embedded in NATO, and NATO has very, very cumbersome decision-making procedures, consensus requirements, and so on. Not to speak of the political opposition there would be as well in some quarters to ending nuclear sharing. So, but I do think it's worthwhile to try to enlarge the scope of discussion about how to settle the war. And I would point out that there's something else in Europe, nuclear related in Europe, that really, really, really concerns the Russians, and that are the two missile defense facilities in Romania and Poland, and you know, possibly they could be part of a settlement as well, or instead. I see there's a question from Peter. Ariana, Peter has raised his hand.
Peter, I am selecting a button that asks you to unmute, and you'll have to click the unmute button in the bottom of your screen so that we can hear you. Unfortunately, it doesn't let me do the full unmute, but if you press the little microphone on the bottom left of your Zoom screen, it should unmute you. I'll send the ask to unmute request once more. That might help make it apparent. No such luck yet.
Well, let's go to another question.
Okay,
Oh, there we
okay.
go.
Here we go.
Tell
Thank
me
you.
when you're touched.
Can you hear me
Where?
now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well,
No,
as
you
I
didn't
said,
hit the window.
this has been
Oh, it was there.
a very effective exposition of what is not only wrong, but also illegal about nuclear sharing. And I would like to add that just explaining what is illegal is not going to move things forward, but there might be a need for some creative litigating. For instance, yesterday, the joining of NATO by Sweden and Finland was approved by NATO. How about a piece of litigation by a Swedish or Finnish civilian arguing that their country should not become a joiner of an illegal operation. I'm not saying that it has great chances of being of winning such a suit, but I think it would be interesting to raise the illegality that we've been talking about for the last hour. That's it.
Thank you, Peter. We'll have to bring this to the attention of our colleagues in Sweden and Finland. There's a distinct question which was raised in the chat. Will Finland and Sweden or Norway, for that matter, get involved in nuclear sharing arrangements? And my assessment would be that no, they will not. And it's a little bit confusing talking about nuclear sharing, because nuclear sharing isn't the only way for nuclear weapons to be deployed in Europe. And that's something else of real concern. Could there be a return to the deployment of short-range and intermediate range missiles that were prohibited by the INF Treaty? So that that's another concern. Ariana, I see there's a question from Alexei Yurk from Russian NGO Peer, which is whether the old project, assuming that there's a settlement, a decent, a long-lasting settlement of the Russian-Ukraine war, would it make sense to revive the old project of a nuclear weapons free zone in Central and Eastern Europe? And I have a short answer to that question too, which is, it's a good question, but it's not something I've really thought about recently. So I don't think I'll try to give an answer to it right now, but it's definitely worthy of consideration.
John, can I add on this? I think this is really important because one thing we have not explored very much is this level of, what can be done at the regional level, right? So we've looked at the UN, we've looked at unilateral declarations, but if you look, for example, the history of nuclear weapon-free zones, those were really mechanisms that non-nuclear weapon states devised during the Cold War to insulate their regions from this, global nuclear confrontation, right? Imperfect as they are, they bring together a real awareness and a collective identity. So I think both normatively and politically, they are incredibly important instruments. One thing I have to say I've recommended to the Office on Nuclear Disarmament Affairs of the UN is that I think it is time that these regional nuclear weapon-free zones start to enter into a dialogue with one another. There have been a few attempts here and there, but the lack of funding, for example, did not allow them to go to work together. I think there is a real political capital there that can be exploited, and I'm sure many Europeans would actually support, for example, being involved in this discussions. One of the conversations I had in particular with the Swedish government is precisely how we can leverage nuclear weapon-free zones as dialogue convener for this negative security assurances. So I think you are tapping into a really important dimension, which is the regional cooperation dimension, that might become really increasingly important.
I think those are some really useful points, Francesca. I appreciate that. And I think it might also be worth, drawing further into the discussion potential and actual already synergy that can exist between the regional nuclear weapon-free zones, the prospect of looking at additional future zones, and tying that into what the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is doing in terms of universalizing the codified illegality of nuclear weapons. And so these nuclear weapon-free zones that, by definition, aren't inclusive yet of any currently nuclear weapon possessor states, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is in the same scenario, are both, as you mentioned, Francesca, contributing significantly to the normative and political development of illegality of nuclear weapons and legitimizing those arguments that have basis in law, but the normative expansion of them is immensely helpful when it comes to having conversations about progressing disarmament substantively. Go ahead, John.
So Ariana, can I pose a question to you? It actually comes out of a question that Jackie Cabasso asked in the chat. Ariana came to LCNP as an intern when she was a CUNY Law School student in 2019. In the fall of 2019, she wrote a really good paper on one of the most difficult questions that I know of in international law, and that is the legal status of threat. Unfortunately, you have now, and I could hear some of that paper in the remarks you made today. Unfortunately, that question is not an abstract one. We've seen not only the 2017 exchange of very serious threats between North Korea and the United States, but now we've seen the Russian threats. So Jackie's question, a hard one, is how would you relate the illegality of threats, specific threats, because you were talking about specific threats, to the legal status of so-called deterrence?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. And despite my research and ongoing thoughts on this issue, one that I don't claim to be expert on by any means. But when I began my research in threat, the foundation of it was looking at the question of what threats of force in general are illegal. More specifically, what threats of nuclear force are illegal, if there's a distinction between which ones are and which ones are not. And there's also that subset question that Jackie and John, you're mentioning now, which is how does deterrence theory fit into that? The short answer, if there is one, in my view, is that nuclear deterrence policies, and I think Jackie, you mentioned this in your comment, I'm not looking at it right now, essentially function as ongoing threats. That's essentially the way deterrence is effective, is nuclear weapon states, or arguably effective. I think my fundamental argument is that it's not effective, and we're seeing right now with the risk of nuclear war among weapon states who claim to have theories of deterrence is increasing, which brings into question whether deterrence is effective at all. However, underlying the foundation of deterrence is this idea that we have nuclear weapon capable countries that want you to know that they can use these weapons, and if they need to, in the various extreme circumstances or less extreme circumstances described in qualifications amidst national nuclear policies, they will. And so that is a broad threat meant to prevent actual use by others, whether certainly nuclear, but also to prevent conventional threats and attacks on those nuclear weapon states. So I think the question is more complicated because you're looking at a broad, ongoing, generalized threat that we might have to use these weapons if you make it necessary, quote unquote, for us to use them. And that's distinct from analyzing a specific threat to, if you interfere in my invasion of this country, you will see a response like you've never seen before, is a lot more specific when there's a war going on. So from a legal perspective, my position would be, we're looking at deterrence essentially as an ongoing illegal threat of nuclear force. It's harder to make a legal argument in part because for example, the International Court of Justice, did a little bit of sidestepping on this issue itself when it addressed the illegality of nuclear use and threats of use. And much of the ICJ 1996 opinion both explained and expanded on already existing foundations for illegality of threats of nuclear use. But they didn't give us a lot more to go on when it comes to deterrence. They chose not to speak to that issue directly. And it would have been nice if they had. John, I'm sure you probably have something to add, and I'd welcome your comments.
Well, I agree with you. And, what I saw at the TPNW negotiations in 2017, and LCNP was engaged on this question of threat. And I think, honestly, I think we played some role in a prohibition of threat being included in the TPNW. But it appeared that governments were ready to accept that specific threats of using nuclear weapons were illegal. They weren't so clear on, ongoing general policies of so-called deterrence. So maybe this is a good time to wrap.
I think you're right. There's so many complex issues. We could go on for some hours more, I'm sure, but there's plenty of opportunity for that throughout the rest of this review conference, with many of the other events coming up next week and beyond. So yes, I'm going to go off of John's suggestion there and move toward the end of our program. I'd just very much like to thank John and Francesca, especially for joining us this afternoon to speak to these difficult and quite frankly disturbing issues in the context we're facing them today, and very much appreciate everybody joining us for this conversation. We will hopefully be able to put together this recording and circulate it for later viewing, and I hope that we will see everybody these next weeks, like I mentioned, at future NPT events and beyond. So thank you so much for your questions and your participation. If Francesca, if you or John have any final remarks, please jump in.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear all the comments, and particularly the legal perspective. It was really, really exciting. I very much look forward to more collaboration with you guys. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I would just say, thank you, Francesca, for joining us. And also, it's very nice to see a number of friends and colleagues on this Zoom.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we'll see you in the future.